Picture an apartment in the dead center of a capital city, one of the biggest, most famous capitals on Earth. Now guess what a single square meter costs. If you're imagining something astronomical, Manhattan money, central London money, you're wrong. In the middle of Moscow, in the summer of 2026, a square meter runs about 680,000 rubles. That's roughly $8,700. Now hold that number next to the West. In Manhattan, the same square meter costs around $18,000, more than double. Central London sits near 10,000. So the heart of the Russian capital is, per square meter, cheaper than New York and cheaper than London. That already breaks most people's assumptions. But it's only the surface. Because the way Russians actually buy, own, and pay for a home works almost nothing like the West. And once you see how cheap per meter turns out to be just half the story. This isn't Russia is cheap or Russia is expensive. It's that the whole machine, the prices, the mortgages, the way apartments are even counted, runs on completely different rules. Start with the map. Moscow isn't one price. In the center, that square meter is about 680,000 rubles. Step out toward the edge of the city, and it drops to around 320,000, less than half. Same city, two different worlds, a pattern you'll see again and again. And here's a small thing that trips up almost every foreigner. Russians don't count bedrooms. They count rooms. What an American calls a one-bedroom, a bedroom plus a living room, a Russian calls a two-room apartment. A Russian one-room is exactly that, one room, total. Keep that in mind every time you see a listing. So we've got a capital that's cheaper per meter than New York or London. That sounds like a bargain. It isn't, not really. Because the price on the listing and the cost of actually owning the place are two completely different numbers. And that gap is where Russia's housing market stops looking familiar and starts looking genuinely strange. So let's break it down. What a Moscow apartment really costs, why almost nobody pays the sticker price, and whether a normal Russian can afford any of it. So what does an actual apartment cost? Not a square meter, but a place you'd really live in. Let's take a typical Russian two-room flat. Remember, that's a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen, about 50 square meters. Out toward the edge of Moscow, at roughly 320,000 rubles a meter, that flat runs about 16 million rubles. At the summer 2026 exchange rate, that's around $205,000. Now move that same 50 meters into the center. On paper, the average is over 30 million rubles, but that average hides a lot of old, tired flats. For something decent and new in central Moscow, you're realistically looking at 50 to 60 million. That's $600,000 to $700,000 for the same 50 square meters. Same flat, same city, but more than 3 times the price, just for the address. New or old changes things too. A brand new apartment in a fresh development, Pervichka, the primary market, averages around 470,000 rubles a meter. An older, resale flat, Turichka, comes in lower, near 370,000. In Russia, unlike much of the West, the shiny new build usually costs more than the lived-in one down the street. And these numbers aren't sitting still. Through 2026, new build prices climbed close to 20% in a single year, resale around 16%. Housing here isn't cheap and forgotten, it's cheap and rising fast. So step back and put those dollar figures next to the West. $200,000 for a 50-meter flat near the edge of Moscow. In Manhattan, at 18,000 a meter, that same 50 meters would run close to 900,000, more than 4 times as much. In central London, around $500,000. The Moscow apartment isn't just cheaper, it's a different tier entirely. What buys you a real family flat near the edge of the Russian capital would barely buy you a studio or a parking spot in Manhattan. Which brings us right back to the thing that sounds too good to be true. If a Moscow flat costs a fraction of a Manhattan one, why isn't everyone buying? Why do so many Russians rent or live with their parents well into their 30s? The answer isn't the price on the listing. It's how you actually pay for it. And that is where this whole story turns. Because the Russian mortgage is unlike almost anything in the West. So a Moscow apartment is cheap by Western standards. The catch isn't the sticker price, it's the loan. Because a normal, market-rate mortgage in Russia, as of late 2025, ran about 21% a year. Let that sink in. 21%. In the United States, a home loan is around 6 or 7. At 21, The math turns brutal. Borrow 16 million rubles for that edge of Moscow flat. Stretch it over 20 years, and you'd pay it back several times over. The monthly payment alone would swallow most of a normal salary. At that rate, almost nobody can actually buy. And here's the thing. The market rate isn't even the rate most buyers pay. Because the Russian state runs a whole menu of subsidized mortgages, and they change everything. There's the family mortgage, 6% a year, for households with children. There's the IT mortgage, 5% for employees of accredited tech companies. And in the Far East, young buyers can get 2%, too, just to keep people from leaving. Against a market rate of 21, these aren't discounts. They're a different universe. So the real Russian housing market isn't cheap apartments plus a normal mortgage. It's cheap apartments, a punishing market rate almost nobody touches, and a maze of state programs that decide who actually gets to buy. Have kids? You're in. Work in tech? You're in. Everyone else stares at 21% or pays cash. And this is exactly why the new build costs more than the resale. Most of those subsidized programs only apply to brand new apartments, bought straight from a developer. So buyers flood the primary market. That demand pushes new build prices up, and the shiny tower ends up pricier than the lived-in flat next door. The subsidy quietly inflates the very thing it's meant to make affordable. Which leaves one last question. If the apartment is cheap, but the market loan is impossible, and the good rates are locked behind having kids or the right job, then who, actually, gets to own a home in Russia? And what does everyone else do instead? So if a market rate mortgage is basically a trap, and the cheap rates only reach a lucky few, who actually owns all these apartments? Here's the number almost no one in the West expects. Around 92% of Russians own the home they live in. 92. In the United States, it's about 65. Russia has one of the highest home ownership rates on the planet. And the reason isn't a booming economy. It's history. When the Soviet Union ended in the early 90s, the state did something extraordinary. It handed the apartments to the people already living in them, essentially for free. Overnight, tens of millions of renters became owners. By the late 2010s, almost 90% of the country's housing stock was privately owned. A whole nation of homeowners, created with a signature. But owning the walls is not the same as having money. This is the quiet catch. A retired teacher in a Moscow panel block might own a flat worth $200,000 and still count coins for groceries. Asset rich, cash poor. You can't eat a square meter. Selling means leaving the only home you have. And buying anything new means facing that 21% all over again. So the generations split. The older generation got their apartment from privatization. The younger one inherits it, one day, or rents, or waits, or leans on a subsidized loan and their parents' savings. In a country where almost everyone owns, buying your own first place is somehow harder than ever. And here's the mirror. In America or Britain, you take a 30-year mortgage and slowly build equity. Ownership is a process. In Russia, ownership was a gift that arrived all at once and then froze in place. Property rich on paper and still doing the math every single month. That's the Russian housing market. Not expensive, not cheap, just built on completely different rules. If that changed how you picture Russian housing, subscribe. There's a whole country to explain, one everyday thing at a time.